Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Canadian Club of Ottawa event, the post-pandemic future of municipalities, how COVID-19 is affecting Canadian cities. I'm Heather Bakken, president of the Canadian Club of Ottawa. And while we're meeting today on a virtual platform, I would like to start by acknowledging the rights of the Indigenous peoples to the land each one of us is on. For the Canadian Club of Ottawa, it is the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Algonquin. The Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of the territory where the Parliament buildings overlook the Ottawa River, which is just downstream from one of the most sacred sites for Indigenous peoples. Now for a few housekeeping notes for our online viewers. If your internet is if your internet quality is poor, use the button, click here to switch stream to view at a lower bandwidth. Your video quality may decrease, but your audio quality should remain the same. If you're having any other technical issues, click the request help bubble at the bottom right corner of the webcast page. Your help request will be emailed back to the address you provided upon registration. To ask a question, simply click the questions tab and type in your question, then click submit. You may ask question at any time during the webcast, pardon me. The moderator will get to as many questions as she can. And now, finally, I would just like to thank our sponsors. The Canadian Club of Ottawa is grateful to our corporate sponsor, RBC Royal Bank, to our gold sponsors, Welsh LLP and TD Bank. And today we will be hearing from our fireside chat sponsor, Municipal Advocacy Solutions. The 2021 virtual season is partnered with Impact Public Affairs, iPolitics, the Hill Times, and the Ottawa Business Journal. I will now pass the mic to Chima Nkenderim, who is here on behalf of today's presenting sponsor, Shaw Communications. He will introduce our esteemed panel and moderator. But first, a 10-second message from one of our media partners.
iPolitics is a proud sponsor of the Canadian Club Ottawa. If you enjoy policy issues and would like a daily dose of policy news, stay tuned for the virtual draw after the panel discussion to win a free subscription to iPolitics.
Thanks, Heather, for the introduction, and thank you for having us here today. My name is Chima Nkenderim. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations at Shaw Communications, and I'm excited to open today's session. Shaw is one of Canada's leading connectivity companies, founded over 50 years ago, and we deliver high-speed internet, video, wireless services to millions of Canadians. Like everyone tuning in, we're all grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'm virtually speaking to you from Calgary. And we've tried to help our customers and Canadians throughout this pandemic by opening up our Wi-Fi network for free to the public, giving our customers extra data, supporting the food banks of Canada, and providing free educational resources to Canadians. At Shaw, we know that municipal leaders are at the forefront of facing the biggest challenges that our communities face, whether it's keeping transit systems open, essential services functioning, working to help the most vulnerable, or supporting local businesses. It is local governments that are leading the way to keep Canadians safe during this pandemic. With that context, I'm really excited to listen to today's panel, and I want to introduce the members of this panel. First, Mayor John Tory. He was born and raised in Toronto. Mayor Tory has spent his life giving back to the city that he loves through his tireless work in public, private, and philanthropic sector roles. Elected as the 65th mayor in Toronto in 2014 and re-elected in 2018, Mayor Tory is focused on making the city more livable, affordable, and functional. He's kept taxes low while investing in priority services, including affordable housing, poverty reduction, and modernizing the government services on which the city relies. Next is Mayor Naheed Nenshi here in Calgary. Naheed Nenshi was sworn in as Calgary's 36th mayor on October 25th, 2010, and was re-elected in 2013 and 2017. He recently celebrated 10 years in office. Prior to being elected as mayor, Mayor Nenshi worked in management consulting where he helped public, private, and nonprofit organizations grow. He joined Mount Royal University where he was Canada's first tenured professor in the field of nonprofit management. For his work, Mayor Nenshi was named the Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum and was awarded the President's Award from the Canadian Institute of Planners. Finally, we have Mayor Jim Watson, who was re-elected as mayor of the city of Ottawa for the third consecutive term on October 22nd, 2018, with more than 71% of the popular vote. Mayor Watson has dedicated most of his career to public servicing in Canada's capital, serving with both the city and as a member of the provincial cabinet. He was first elected as a city councillor in 1991 and was re-elected in 1994 before being elected as the youngest mayor in Ottawa's history in 1997 with 82% of the popular vote. Vote numbers only that Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump would die for today. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Carole Saab. Carole is a tireless champion of cities and communities, driving an ambitious vision for local government leadership in building a sustainable and prosperous future for our communities. Carole's an accomplished strategist with a decade of experience in federal and municipal advocacy. A high-performing and goal-oriented, Carole has been driving force behind watershed achievements for municipalities, securing unprecedented investment and progress for cities and communities. Recognized by her peers as a tenacious, ambitious, and game changer, she's constantly voted as one of the top 100 lobbyists in Canada. And in 2020, she was a recipient of Canada's Top 40 Under 40 and Women of Influence Award. And so it's a thrill to introduce Carole today. On behalf of Shaw, I want to thank all of you for joining the Canada Club today and hosting some very, very important conversation. And please let me hand it over to Carole.
Hey, thank you very much, Chima. Thank you, Heather and the Canadian Club. And thank you to all of you for joining us virtually. It's a real pleasure to join you for today's conversation. As Chima mentioned, cities and communities have been on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the three mayors you have with you here today on this panel have done really a commendable job at protecting their residents and limiting community transmission. And FCM has been working with them every step of the way, from shaping pandemic response to bringing urgent attention to the municipal financial crisis stemming from the pandemic. Together with big city mayors across the country, including the three joining us today, we made it very clear that plummeting local revenues and rising costs threaten the vital services Canadians rely on, as well as Canada's economic recovery. And that approach worked. The Safe Restart Agreement between Ottawa and the provinces was a direct response to relentless advocacy from mayors and municipal leaders across the country through FCM. It includes $8.6 billion in crucial upfront relief for cities and communities, which meant that municipalities could keep essential services going strong while staying in a position to lead the recovery on the ground. And it's true that we still face tough choices. We'll get into that a bit later today on the panel together. But together we've set an important precedent of what's possible when governments work together. Canadians. And I know that all three mayors on the panel would agree that the top priority continues to be ensuring that municipalities can protect their residents while keeping vital services running. We're also today going to talk a little bit about a strong municipal vision for Canada's recovery going forward. The fact is, recovering from this pandemic will require a bold plan driven by the governments closest to daily life. And it's also going to require unprecedented collaboration from all orders of government, with municipalities directly at the table. What's before us now, amid all of these challenges, is an opportunity to bring the country back stronger than ever. And just like Canada's pandemic response, the nationwide recovery must be rooted in cities and communities across the country. And local leaders are ready to build more prosperous, resilient, and connected Canada, a Canada that's inclusive for everyone. And so that means raising people's quality of life through renewed infrastructure, affordable housing, modern transit, and solutions that help protect our most vulnerable. It means also preparing for future shocks now by cutting GHG emissions and adapting to new weather extremes. That's really the kind of leadership that Canadians can expect from municipal leaders in the months ahead. I have the pleasure of seeing it firsthand myself every single day, working with these mayors. Smart, pragmatic solutions grounded in the daily realities that their residents are facing. And so that's the key to building stronger communities out of the pandemic. It's how we'll build a better Canada together. And I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I'm going to dive right in, and we'll go through some questions and some themes. We'll ask the mayors a reminder, friends, to keep your comments to about 2 minutes when you're answering questions to make sure we share the mic time. I negotiated
You're
hard.
Such a dreamer, Carole. You're such a dreamer.
No, I learned from our friends south.
Watson can't even clear his throat in 2 minutes.
See, they're already unruly. Let's get into it, and let's start on what has been an important thematic throughout this pandemic because of how critical it is to protecting Canadians, which is the financial backstop of municipalities. And so municipalities have taken extraordinary steps, from rebalancing streets to leasing motels as COVID-safe shelters. But again, rising costs against falling revenues, and with municipalities absent the ability to run deficits, they faced across the country a crisis of non-recoverable operating losses. And when we appealed for emergency operating funding to protect frontline services, we saw in response a federal government-led collaborative response with provinces and territories through the Safe Restart agreements, which again, as I said, provided about $8.6 billion in support for transit and municipal operations. We'll talk in a minute about the time-limited nature of that, what that means for 2021, but I wanted to start, Mayors, first by asking you about this first tranche of money, and if you could elaborate a little bit on how that emergency support impacted your ability to respond to the pandemic. And so, Mayor Tory, maybe I'll start with you here on this question.
Well, my numbers will seem, incomprehensible in terms of the size, but the fact is, if it hadn't been for these programs, and I'm looking forward to talking about 2021 because I'm worried that it was even difficult with the federal, provincial, municipal aspect of this to achieve what we did in the height of an emergency. So as the emergency hopefully fades away, but the problems are still there to some extent, you hope that that collaboration can continue. But in our case, for example, we were losing $25 million a week on transit fares that weren't being paid by people who weren't riding the transit. So by the time that package came forward, we'd already lost revenue of about $500 or $600 million just on that alone. You may say, well, okay, you could figure that out in some way or other. Well, the fact of the matter is that we had to keep the vast majority of the transit system going so that the essential workers could get to work, and so that the healthcare workers and all those kinds of people, we didn't have the option of kind of just saying, well, let's shut down the transit system. And so it was a lifesaver. But it was a bit of sausage making that you saw a glimpse of that you didn't really necessarily want to see repeated because, it got done. And I give credit to both the feds and the province. And the feds have done many more things, including the wage subsidy program. And without those things, frankly, being done quickly, being done initially on a very broad, open basis, and then later becoming more targeted, I think the downtowns of our cities and large parts of our cities would have been destroyed. I mean, that's not even too strong a word economically, and there would be a much tougher challenge for us to come back, even though that is far from done. So I'll give you one more example, and then I'll move on to colleagues. On sheltering, we had a situation, again, the numbers are big in Toronto, but we had to move 3,000 people from our shelters where they were for physical distancing reasons to other accommodations. So you can imagine the cost. We've ended up spending about $200 million on moving people and finding alternate accommodation for them. Had it not been for the help we got from the other governments, and given our inability both to raise money, and that's a subject for later discussion perhaps, and the archaic arrangements we're trapped in from 1867, and our inability to run a deficit, which I strongly support that law that says we have to balance our books, I don't know what we would have done in terms of moving people to places where they would not get the virus, where they were properly distanced and safely and properly looked after some of our most vulnerable residents. So the program was a lifesaver. The process leading to it was one that we've got to fix, because you can't be in a situation where you're sort of scrambling around, having all these intergovernmental discussions and worried about whose turf is whose. And we got over it. But I mean, I'm worried that when the emergency was less intense, we wouldn't get over it in a second chapter, which must come for 2021, as you said, we'll discuss.
And certainly that was a situation that was echoed across the country. Maybe Mayor Nenshi could give us the view from Calgary.
Sure. Thanks, Carole. And hey, congratulations on your top 40 under 40 win. Very well deserved. We're thrilled for you. And thanks, Chima, for that great introduction. He introduces me a lot these days and never points out the one part of my biography, which is extremely poor judgment in hiring chiefs of staff. But at least we've sent him off to the private sector now. So everything John says is exactly what we see here in Calgary. We are coping, as everyone is, with 4 simultaneous crises. We have the pandemic and the critical issue of protecting everyone's health and safety. We have the mental health crisis, which was happening before, but has been laid bare by the pandemic. We've lost far more people to opioid overdose than we've lost to COVID in this year. We have, of course, the economic crisis, which we share everything John said here in Calgary in terms of decline of storefront retail, small business, and so on. But with us, it's also in the context of an overall economic downturn, an overall economic malaise, which has led us to be surfing at the highest levels of unemployment of any Canadian city for almost 5 years now. So this was just a pylon on that. Oh, and did I mention, we also had the 4th largest natural disaster in Canadian history in the middle of this summer. I bet nobody even knew that because it happened in the middle of the pandemic. But we had a devastating hailstorm that caused nearly 60,000 people to have very significant damage. No, more than 60,000 people, 60,000 homes to have very significant damage. Oh, and all of that is happening on the backdrop of a much delayed and critical conversation about how we become a truly anti-racist society. So it's been a fun year to be the mayor. Those of us who like problems, well, we got lots of them. But fundamentally, we're in the same boat. The numbers, of course, are different with us versus Toronto. We have never run a deficit before, as everyone. And we are looking at a between $150 and $400 million shortfall at the end of the year. That said, we've been able to mitigate that. We've laid off about 15% of our staff. It's been very, very difficult, very tough choices. And the federal restart money should mean about $200 million to the city of Calgary between the transit portion and the operating cost portion. That will keep the wolves at bay. That will get us through this year, but it will not get us through 2021 unless things radically change. So like with John, we have many of the same challenges. And the very last thing I'll say is Mayor Kennedy Stewart's not with us on this panel, or none of us would get to talk, but I saw him in the paper this morning saying that in his province, the provincial government has allocated the Safe Restart funding to smaller municipalities, leaving him far short of what he needs to balance his budget. In Alberta, that has not happened. Although I haven't received a check yet, the province was very good about sending me a letter saying exactly how much we were getting, and I expect that is.
Thanks, Mayor Nenshi. Mayor Watson, over to you.
Great, thank you, and thanks to the Canadian Club of Ottawa for bringing us together virtually. As Mayor Nenshi said, we're in the same boat. Every municipality, whether big or small, is facing financial shortfalls as a result of COVID-19. Our initial estimate was about $192 million. We've now whittled that down to about, I think, $181 million. We've received so far about $124 million from the Restart program, which has been terrific. I'm very appreciative of the Premier and the Prime Minister, and certainly the work Carole, you and FCM did to get that in front of Cabinet and the decision makers. But we still need to apply for the second round of funding. I think, John, you're doing the same thing for Toronto to fill that gap so we end the year not in a deficit, which of course we're not allowed to, and we don't have to go into our reserve funds to pay for that. The bigger challenge we face, of course, is unlike a natural disaster where there's a beginning and an end, there's a beginning to COVID, but we have no idea when it's going to end. Is it going to end with a vaccine in 5 months, 6 months? No one knows. So we're looking at potentially $150, $160 million next year in additional costs. And when you think of it, the municipalities are really on the front lines of providing those vital services to individuals. Things like public health, paramedic service, police, social services. Something you don't think of, but more people are staying at home, which means more garbage is generated at your residence, and that's slowing the whole garbage recycling pickup, which adds to the cost both financially and to greenhouse gases when the trucks are spending more time at each person's laneway to empty their garbage or their recycling. So all of these costs that you keep burrowing up through the ground, you recognize that it has to be done. These are vital services and we need to get these things done, the water system and so on, but we don't have the resources to do it. We have basically three sources of revenue: property taxes, which is a regressive form of taxation. It doesn't really equate to your lot in life at that time. It's an unrealized capital gain, the whole market value assessment system. We get funding from other levels of government, and then fees and fines and so on. But it's not nearly enough for us at the municipal level to go and provide those basic services. So our next task at the City of Ottawa, and I think any municipality in the country, is to lock down the numbers of what we can expect in phase 2 of the startup funding for this year to balance the books. And then we have to convince our partners to continue working with us for 2021, because of course on January 1st, ridership is not going to go back up to pre-COVID levels, and recreation programs are not going to go through the roof in terms of registration. We're still going to have those shortfalls of revenue and the increases in expenses. And finally, that's been the perfect storm that we've had. We've had a combination of increased costs for everything from public health to paramedics, and reduced revenues. We're at 30% of our capacity in our train and bus system in Ottawa right now, 30%, because so many people are working from home and so many people have lost their jobs and they don't have a place to go in the downtown. So those are some real challenges, but the restart funding has been a godsend to us. And I've certainly, when I've been in discussion with the Prime Minister or his colleagues and the Premier, they understand that, the finish line is not on December 31st. We need them for 2021 as well.
Carole, just a small example before we move on. In the case of the transit shortfall for 2020, the Toronto experience, we normally have 1.8 million passengers a day, and it went down to about 500,000. It's come back up now to maybe 650. But if we'd had to absorb the $800 million revenue loss, it would have meant increasing property taxes by 20 points. 20 points, because each point produces, and so like it's a ridiculous thing to even contemplate. Even in good times, you wouldn't be doing that. People can't do that, but that's all we've got. I mean, we've got, as Jim said, we've got some fines, and we happen to have a municipal land transfer tax, but the bulk of our money, and all cities, comes from property taxes, and that's why this thing is archaic. It's not meant to deal with the needs of a big city with a sophisticated transit system, which all three of us have. And that's why this stuff has to be re-examined. But for now, we're going to focus on 2021. But that's what it would do. 20-point increase in property tax just to look after the transit shortfall during the pandemic, year one only. Crazy.
It is crazy, and Mayor Tory, we ran the math, and the numbers are that stark really across the country in terms of the kind of jump it would require in the property tax to compensate for it. And so, Canadian Club, hopefully you'll have us back to talk about what a modernized relationship should look like with the cities in this country, so that we can move more in a more resilient way out of this kind of an archaic setup. But let's talk about 2021, and I'm glad, mayors, that you both outlined the numbers as they relate to your city and the costs that you're facing, as well as the increase in responsibilities. And add to that list that cities and communities across the country also took measures like deferring property taxes to ease the burden on their citizens as well. And so this really has been quite a perfect storm of impact. And part of the reason I'm glad you provided your numbers in as much detail as you did is $8.6 billion sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but put into context of what cities in this country are facing, that gave, kept the wolves at bay, to use your quote, Mayor Nenshi, for about 6 to 8 months. And we're now coming to the tail end of that. And I know all of you are looking at your budgets in your 2021 year to figure out how your city is going to manage this challenge while ensuring essential services continue to be delivered. And the necessity of additional operating support certainly is there. And so maybe I can ask each of you to put this in real terms for us. How will declining revenue impact the delivery of the critical services and social programs going forward in your community if there isn't a round two of this kind of a backstop while we figure out a longer term game plan for how to fund cities? I'll just throw it open for whoever wants to jump in on that question.
Well, in our case, we're already in a very difficult situation given the economic situation, and we've been working hard to reduce our tax take, particularly on small business, using that incredibly blunt tool of the property tax. We spent over $500 million from our reserves in blunting the impact of assessment shift from a declining downtown to businesses outside of the downtown. And I'm running out of money. I've often said that the city of Calgary is that rare ant in the story of the ant and the grasshopper, in that we saved up when times were good. We made sure that we were resilient and ready to accommodate shock. But this is shock after shock after shock, and I'm running out of money. So council has told administration that we must have a budget at a tax freeze or better on average for 21, and we will release that budget publicly on Monday. I get to see it when the public sees it, but my understanding is that we will achieve that goal of a tax freeze or better. But that's based on some pretty optimistic assumptions about what's going to happen to our revenues. Now, our property tax defaults were double what we expected, what they would be in a normal year, but less than we expected them to be. So we deferred our property taxes by 3 months, give people a little bit of a cash flow break. And in the end, we've collected about 90%. We normally collect about 95%. We also reduced the penalty for people who don't pay, cut it in half. So hopefully we will be able to get to full payment. We do have the ability to seize the property and sell it. Nobody wants to do that. And that's a long process in any case. So our defaults haven't been terrible. But John is a victim of his own success. He has by far the most successful transit system in the country in terms of fare box revenue. Our fare box revenue is about 50% of our operating cost of transit, which is pretty standard for most cities of our size. But if transit doesn't come back, and transit coming back requires the economy to come back and jobs to come back and people to go to work, not work from home. If that doesn't come back, then we're going to be in another position next year where, although we managed to hold the line on taxes, we're going to be looking at a huge deficit. The Alberta context, because people who come to the Canadian Club of Ottawa to listen to three mayors are policy nerds. So I will explain that our Alberta context is a bit different in that we can run a deficit under our city charter, but we can't budget for one. So in other words, we have to budget a balanced budget. But if something bad happens and we end up with a deficit, we have a couple years to pay it off. But the only way to pay it off is to increase property taxes, a horrible regressive tax that'll make life worse, as John says. So we're really in a bind, and it is certain, I can say that right now, it is certain that we will need assistance from the federal government on transit operating next year, if not broader assistance on our operating budgets for at least one more year.
If I could offer a comment, Carole, to your point with respect to the discretion we have in our budgets. Most people don't realize there's very little discretionary spending in a municipal budget. We're so-called creatures of the province constitutionally, which I hate that expression, but the reality is the province sets standards on social services and sets standards on a whole range of areas that we have no wiggle room to get out of. Arbitrators decide you're going to have 4 firefighters on a pumper instead of 2 or 3. Those are cast in stone. And I'm often amused when people run for office, they say, I'm going to take that budget and cut all the fat out. It's really about, I think it's about 15% in terms of the discretion we have on programs like recreation and so on. The rest is very much governed by the province, partly funded in province, social services, for instance. But the reality is we don't have a lot of wiggle room ourselves. We tabled our budget on Wednesday. I made a commitment in the last election to keep the property tax cap at or below 3%. We're doing that because, no disrespect to the Mayor of Calgary, I'm glad you're bringing in a tax freeze, but it makes it harder for us to go to the province and the federal government and say, we need more money. And if you're reducing taxes or freezing taxes, they'll say, well, why don't you do your part and then we'll help supplement it. So, 3% is in a tough economy is a challenge, but people understand that it's going to these basic frontline services that our public are expecting. And you can go through a public delegation and determine, what do you think is a basic service? Everyone has a different opinion. Some people think libraries are a frill. Other people think libraries are essential. And you go through the list, it's a real challenge, and you have to explain to your constituents that we don't have a lot of flexibility to move. We can't take money out of the development charges and put it into a recreation facility, for instance. That they have to go into certain categories that are governed by provincial law and that we are subject to as municipalities.
So, Carole, I'll just supply a couple of numbers that back up everything my two friends have said. We, in our case, just doing the numbers now because we're in the midst of our budget preparation, because, as my friends both said, the transit ridership will not come back in 2021. I mean, we hope it does to the maximum extent possible, because as Nahed said, I think it means people are going to work and so on. But, we expect it to come back, but not anywhere near to full ridership. We expect our transit revenue shortfall in 2021 to be $400 or $500 million. So as I previously indicated, that would result in 10 points of property tax. When you add all that stuff up, including the fact that we will continue to have to shelter more people than normal and in physically distanced circumstances and all of that, a lot of those costs continue into 2021. We're presently projecting that our shortfall would be about $1.5 billion, north of $1.5 billion on a $14 billion budget. And that and so that's after we found $500 million in different kinds of savings and things we've done to try and reduce the cost of government after that. So if we don't get help, then I would say that consistent with my friends, I mean, I won't get into who's a bigger economic driver in the country than any other. We're all three, plus other cities like Montreal and Edmonton and Vancouver. We are the economic engines of the country. Money invested in our cities now to help us with these problems so we can keep the transit going, keep sheltering people who are our most vulnerable citizens, keep supporting small businesses and so on, will not only help protect those people during the remainder of the pandemic, which we hope will get over sometime next year. But, I think we've got to assume it's going to last. I believe it will be a fundamental investment in the rebuilding of the country's finances, because as you get people able to go back to work and businesses that survive and transit systems that are running to take people to work and so on, you will then have people actually earning income, paying tax on it, businesses back in earning income and paying tax, and the federal government's finances will prove this to be one of the best investments they ever made, and the provinces. So I really dearly hope that, since the need is, I've just outlined what it is in our city, it's $1.5 billion or north of that we need that help again to keep us in a situation where we can contribute to a robust recovery across the country and in our own city, which is something we dearly want to do.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mayor Tory. It's an important point on how self-fulfilling this is about the broader economic recovery that the country needs to go to. And I'll just add as well, it goes without saying, but it's worth highlighting that some of these pieces like transit are the backbone of livable cities, and also key to achieving other really national objectives like net zero emissions as we continue to move forward. And so really, really important message there. I want to shift the conversation a little bit now to vulnerable populations and the role that your cities have played in leading a response to support vulnerable populations and rebuild a bit more inclusively. I mean, we've all talked about it. The pandemic has laid bare how unequally Canadians thrive or struggle. And we've seen, vulnerable people forming tent encampments, physical distance shelters and vital services struggling, women facing more economic stress, as well as an increase in gender-based violence. I mean, these realities are not new, but they certainly are intensifying signs of persistent inequality. And so, I want to ask you a sort of a two-parter question. And one is a direct response to a specific initiative that was in place, and the other is more broadly what kind of supports you and your teams in your cities have put in place to support more vulnerable people in your cities. And then we saw a response from the federal government in the Rapid Housing Initiative, and a two-time boost as well to the Reaching Home homelessness initiative that really give us a bit of a running start to our appeal for more sustainable solutions. And so looking to you, what have you put in place? And then looking at something like the Rapid Housing Initiative, how do we scale that up and scale up that kind of a model to help ensure an inclusive economic recovery in Canada? Mayor Nenshi, maybe I'll start with you here.
The issues around poverty and vulnerability are critical, and COVID has really laid bare many things. So I'm actually going to very uncharacteristically take a bit more time, because I think people really need to understand what we're talking about here, because it's not just about homeless people and people you see on the street and so on. We have allowed and abided and turned a blind eye to the creation of an extraordinarily class-based economic system in our country. And COVID has helped us think about things that most of us haven't thought about before. So every single morning in every one of our cities, people get up very early in the morning. They're mostly women. They're mostly new Canadians. And after getting breakfast for their families on the table, early in the morning, they get on the bus and they go work at a long-term care center where the operator only gives them 30 hours a week so they don't have to pay benefits. And they wake up our grandparents and change their diapers and get them breakfast. They do that for breakfast and lunch. Then they get on another bus, go across town to another long-term care center for their second full-time job. And they do the same thing again in the evenings. And when COVID started, we blamed these folks. And we said, how dare you work at 2 long-term care centers? You're spreading the virus. You're dangerous. We've created an economic system where we can't survive without these people. And now we call them essential service workers. And we, honk horns for them. But the folks who work in meatpacking plants and warehouses and in retail and grocery stores and in many, many parts of the healthcare system are among the lowest paid people in our community. And they're the people we're putting at the greatest risk. They don't have the ability to stop and work from home. They can't physically distance or isolate, because if they did, our economy would collapse. So at the moment, sorry, John, nobody needs lawyers. Nobody needs a securities lawyer right now. But we need drivers and workers and so on. And so I hope, if I'm hopelessly naive, that when we come out of this, we really think hard about how we make sure that we have, as you say, an equitable recovery, but not just a recovery, not going back to what we were, because that didn't work for so many people. And we've got to figure out how to do a better job of looking after everyone in our community. So very quickly then, to answer your question, we've been terrified about outbreaks in the homeless population because it will spread like wildfire. We have an outbreak right now at the jail in Calgary, the Calgary Correctional Center, and it's almost 100% of people have it. Because how in the world do you physically isolate in a situation like that? And so we've done work with our province. We don't run the social services the province does, but we've done work with our province on overflow shelters. We've used our city convention center as a shelter. We're currently looking for winter shelter to help people who've been living in encampments. And by the way, the encampments are nothing new. There's encampments every day of the year in every city. You just don't know about them. But now they've become more of a bigger issue for all of us. The Rapid Housing Initiative is something that we pushed hard. Toronto has been leaders on this as well, though, with their own set of problems, because this is a moment where when we have distressed hotel properties, when we have distressed rental properties that are being built but don't have any tenants, we really do have the ability to purchase housing assets at pennies on the dollar. And it's a window of opportunity that will close quickly. So we are very, very happy with the federal government for doing this. But I got to tell you something. One of the challenges we have in this great confederation of ours is that we always look for national solutions to national problems. But the problems that Mayor Tory is facing or Mayor Stewart are facing in Vancouver around housing are completely different than the problems we're facing in Calgary. And in fact, in Calgary, with a relatively modest, it's a big number, but it's relatively modest in the scheme of the world, investment in housing stock, $300 million from the federal government and $240 million from the provincial government, I commit that we could end chronic homelessness in Calgary in the next 18 months. We could end it, and we could be the first country in the world, well, in the Western world, to be able to say we've ended chronic homelessness. But the Rapid Housing Initiative, because it's allocated on a national basis, got us $24 million. I love it. I'm thrilled to have it. It is less than 5% of what I need.
Can I just pick up on that, Carole, by talking about and connecting the dots? Because, Naheed talked earlier about the sort of class-based economic system that's been evolving over time and the two jobs and so on. It also ties in, of course, to the fact that those very same people, and when you look at the maps in Toronto, you can just look at them when they measure the intensity of the COVID experience, infection among different neighborhoods, that the very same people he referred to are living in neighborhoods where, because of their economic and financial circumstances, they're often sharing an apartment with another family. And of course, that in and of itself has led, it's an unacceptable situation in terms of the availability of affordable housing for those people who are vital parts of the economy, as Naheed said, and people who want to live in a city that has all different people from all different walks of life living in it as a part of its health. But it's also, we've now proven, of course, that something we probably should have known, that it's a health risk as well, because that is where you've seen the spread of the virus, not just at work, but in the home, where it's impossible for somebody. And thank goodness, again, the federal government came forward and allowed us to establish an isolation hotel so that people who live in housing like that could go and isolate when they were found to test positive, instead of staying at home in the apartment and trying to isolate in an apartment, a small apartment with 6 people living in it. But so that was another good thing they worked on with us. But it really points to how there's a connection of the dots in terms of more vulnerable people between, say, what Naheed said about their employment experience and their precarious employment and their housing. And I will just say, one of the things that I think has come out of this is that we have moved of necessity to looking at something that was probably good to look at, which is that there's a business case here. I hate to raise that in the context of kind of the moral responsibility that I think Naheed and I would both make reference to, but there's a business case that I think finally, certainly the federal government has actually been willing to experiment with us on, if that's the right word, in terms of this rapid housing initiative, where it is actually cheaper, let alone much better for the people, to have us invest in buying properties, buying hotels, as he suggested, and so on, to create more housing, especially supportive housing, where there's another whole scandal there, not just in terms of people with 2 jobs, but people with mental health issues and substance use issues who are just being left. And you've seen it more in stark relief during this whole thing on the streets because people are more visible now because the streets are not as crowded with people. It's scandalous. But there's a business case that says if you make these investments now through things like the Rapid Housing Program, it is not only way more humane, but it is way cheaper than what we end up doing, which is seeing them in emergency rooms, seeing them in shelters, and so on, where the cost actually on a per night, per visit basis is way higher than if you actually provide supportive or affordable housing for them. So I think that has been laid bare as well by the pandemic, and is going to be something that you hope we carry forward in terms of permanent practice with the other governments. Because again, we cannot do this as cities alone. There is no chance. The math is all the same on how much money you raise per point of property tax, and property taxes were not meant to pay for social programs, period, full stop, ever. It wasn't even contemplated. And the notion, no offense to our friends in Prince Edward Island, who have, I think, 146,000 people, less than 1/4 of the population of Scarborough, which is 1/4 of the population of Toronto. And they have all kinds of measures they can undertake and liberties they're given as a province compared to cities of millions of people like our three that have no latitude to deal with these things, except the property tax. It's just not acceptable.
I think, Carole, excuse me, Carole, one of the issues that I think came to light as a result of COVID was the sheer number of people that live paycheck to paycheck in our city. And once that paycheck stopped, thank goodness the feds came through with the Saab and other programs, because these people would be in desperate straits. We set up a human needs task force and an economic recovery task force within the first 2 weeks of COVID arriving in Canada, in Ottawa in specific. And the human needs task force is doing similar work to what Mayors Nenshi and Tory have talked about in their community. One of the challenges we have is that housing in Ontario, we're the only province where the cities are responsible for housing, not the provinces, and that really has to change, because we can't put those costs on the property tax bill. We added another $15 million in our budget. There's always lots of calls for more money to do that, but we need to get the province to get back into the housing business in a much more forceful way, number one. And secondly, the problem we have is that we're very appreciative of Minister Hussein providing the funding for modular homes and buying hotels and so on. But the history of housing for the last 20 years has been quick. Here's an announcement. There's another announcement. We need a continuous flow of dollars for both capital and operating for supportive housing so that we can plan for the future. We're given these funds. We're often told it's going to be used by March 31st or whatever the deadline is. And it's not a good way to run any kind of an organization when you have to sort of get the money out the door quickly. People know that, so you don't always get the best price in terms of buying a hotel or buying more space. So we need to get, we talk a lot about a national housing strategy, but we need that constant, consistent, and reliable flow of money to the big cities in particular, because the vast majority of people who are homeless are living in the big cities. They're not, there are some homeless challenges in small rural communities, but it's a big, big problem. And I think of John and the challenges he has are huge compared to even a city of our size. But, we need that kind of a dialogue from the federal government. And, we appreciate the fact that money came and they want to get it out. It's called RAPID for a reason. They want to get people out, with shelters and off the street. But it makes it really difficult because it's almost, it's like we used to call it March Madness. Let's get the money out the door at Queen's Park before March 31st, because that's the end of the fiscal year. That's not a way to run something as important as affordable housing in our society.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Watson, and to all of you. I think you're underscoring a point, all of you, and I think one of the bigger ones, Mayor Nenshi, was certainly that the need is different in cities across the country and communities across the country. And I'll just say that, and Mayor Tory, maybe I'll ask you to follow up on the Toronto perspective here, given that you're the biggest city. But one of the, I think the urgency behind the Rapid Housing Initiative and trying to do this is to try to get it out the door, given the urgency of the situation, trying to get ahead of winter. And certainly to all of your points, $1 billion isn't going across the country, isn't going to solve the problem. The scale of need is so much higher. But one of the interesting things that did happen was certainly the way the money has been distributed, first direct to cities to work with community partners on getting this out, as well as the formula for the first tranche of that is based on poor housing need. And so I'm wondering, Mayor Tory, given you're the largest city in the country, What is that? Is that a hopeful model from your perspective? How does that set us up? And is that something we should be really continuing to push to scale up going forward?
Well, I think, first of all, based on need, it makes sense. But secondly, going direct to municipalities also makes sense. But let me tell you that in this complicated system of government, it shouldn't be so complicated, but I guess it turns out to be. The provinces are not, people that can be missing partners in this. Because, for example, part of this rapid housing money will go to help us build modular housing, which they've done in Vancouver quite successfully. We're just doing it here for the first time now, which will turn into supportive housing for people with mental illness and substance use issues and so on. And of course, so the federal government is helping us with the capital. We're putting a lot in of city money for capital to put in the land and put in some deferred taxes and so on. But the operating costs, which actually pay for the mental health nurses and the substance use counselors and so forth, has to come from the province because it's part of the healthcare system. And the modular housing we're presently building with the money that's come from the federal government, we have no commitment as of this moment, none. We've been asking for it from our provincial government to pay for the operating costs too. And we actually are going to prove through this program that you can go from a concept in June to actually moving people in December because it's modular housing. So it's going to be there. The rooms are going to be there. The modules are, very interestingly enough, dropped into place like Lego with the furniture in them. So it's not even as if we're behind on buying the furniture, but we may not be able to open these things properly because we don't have the money to pay for the nurses and the counselors to help the people that live there. We've got to get our act together in this country. And it always seems to be the case that as soon as you get the federal government coming up with an imaginative, intelligent program at this point in time, as Mihid said, it's a moment in time, like the rapid housing, and the city is prepared to play ball, and we were ready to go. We were ready to move forward with these projects. We have a long list, too long for the money we'll get. Then you sort of have this conundrum you run up against where you're saying, except that the operating costs for these places we're going to put in place are not available from the provincial government, which is responsible for health. We've got to get that sorted out because you know what? It's not about us as governments, municipal, provincial, or federal. It's actually about the people we're trying to help and who are going to live a better life. And frankly, as I said earlier, a less expensive life from the standpoint of government support if we can do it this way than if we were putting them in a shelter or having them in an encampment or on the street. And so in our case, I strongly support the needs-based assessment. And I know that creates some unhappiness elsewhere with people don't have problems as big as us. We shelter 8,000 people every night. And so that's just a fact. And it's a regional thing, by the way. It's another complaint I have, which people in Ottawa might understand. And Jim was right about Ontario making us deal with housing. But we take people in from the whole region because they know Toronto has services available. And we end up paying for that out of Toronto taxes, which is also ridiculous. But having said that, we have to start to focus on the people that are getting the help here and say it's all hands on deck. And there's been unprecedented collaboration during the pandemic. My fear is only that when the pandemic is over, everybody will go back to their corners and we'll be left as the people delivering the services, actually producing and putting in place and this housing, supportive housing, with no dance partners. Because they'll all sort of say, well, it's somebody else's job. It's our collective job. And the job has been laid bare by the pandemic, but it's not going to go away. It's still going to be there. It always was.
Well said, Mayor Tory. I know we wanted to also cover off a conversation around the impact on local businesses and small businesses in your cities. And in fact, I'm looking at our time, but in fact, those are the audience questions that have come in as well. And so why don't we take a couple questions from the audience here? And I'll take the first one is from David Coletto, who many of you will know as well as head of Advocacy Data. And his question really is asking specifically about supports for the hospitality sector, restaurants, hotels, bars, given their disproportionate hit by health measures that are necessary. And so wondering if each of you could speak to that. I know who wants
thanks, David, for the question. We launched a couple of initiatives, but it shows you how limited an ability we have at the municipal level to assist businesses. We're not allowed to directly assist a business. It's called bonusing in Ontario. But there are things that we can do to help the sector. We set up the Mayor's Economic Recovery Task Force that has all of our different business groups from around the city. We launched a Buy Local campaign, encouraging people to go and shop locally, buy gift certificates and so on. We created a business reopening toolkit that's been copied by many other jurisdictions around the country. We launched a rural tourism cycling campaign to help rural Ottawa. We have our patio fees have been waived this year and next year, extended the patio season. Those are the kinds of things that we have the authority to do, but they're limited in scope, obviously. We did a tax deferral program as well. I think maybe 1,000 or 2,000 businesses took advantage of that. It wasn't a large uptake, but we insisted that if a landlord was going to take advantage of that tax deferral, they had to pass those savings on to their tenants, so it wouldn't just be the big landlord that reaps the benefit of that ability to solve a bit of a cash flow problem for 4 or 5 months. So those were some of the specific things that we ended up doing, and we continue to meet on a weekly basis. This economic task force, which has our groups like the Regroupement des gens d'affaires, which is the Francophone Board of Trade, the Board of Trade, our film office, Ottawa Tourism, as well as Invest Ottawa and the BIAs.
We did some of the same things, Carole. We had a tax deferral, which was helpful, but it was, again, because of our limited resources, we could only defer so many taxes for so long, because otherwise you still have to fill in the hole that is even caused by the cost of money during that time. A couple of things Jim mentioned. We did something that went a little beyond extending patio season and actually allowed for patios to be put, and this is something in Europe they would say big deal, but it was a big deal here, where we allowed patios to be put onto the right of way, onto the street, for example, which at a time when indoor dining was either restricted or was unappealing to people, it really was a lifeline for a lot of places. So 700 plus restaurants got patios that were either on parking lots or on the street, right on the street, or out onto the sidewalk to a greater extent. And we've extended those actually right up until now, even though the weather's got colder, so that allowed them to have some revenue when they were closed, but also to have some additional revenue when they were open. The other thing we did was a program called Digital Main Street, which the federal government picked up and took across the country. And it simply allowed us to take advantage of some really great help we got from some big tech firms and from small tech firms, and a program that we sort of put in place. And we put 8,000 businesses so far online that weren't online before. And so you can imagine, for a small business, it either had the choice of keeping in touch with its customers who didn't come out to the store because people weren't going out or whatever, and or reaching a national or international audience to sell their goods because they were online for the first time. And it wasn't just online with a sort of half-baked website. It was a full e-commerce store presence that was done at virtually no cost. In fact, I think no cost to the store itself. And we had 8,000 businesses so far that we put online, which I think was a real help of the kind we could offer in partnership with the private sector, and some government funding, but limited, to help those businesses to sort of see their way through the pandemic and hopefully be alive on the other side. And of course, I just have to say, the federal government's programs were lifesavers on this. I mean, the wage subsidy program, the new rent program, which has not yet taken effect, but I hope the parties, and if there's anybody in that room or in this virtual room from Parliament that can talk to the parties and say, pass that bill pronto, that is going to help these businesses a lot. Small businesses, restaurants, and so on. They need that help. They need it directly to them, which the federal government's found out a way to do. And they need the wage subsidy program to continue, which the same bill provides for. So those are huge helps they've given that I think are going to make a big difference to the survival of some of these businesses to see another day.
So strongly agree with everything that's been said. We did all of those things too. Streets, patios in the streets, winterized patios. We set up a business support task force very early, where we brought in business people and just said, what do you need right now? But the biggest thing here is really a cultural shift that this has enabled within the city administration. Because of the relationship that we have with businesses, we're the ones who are the permit givers. We often see ourselves as regulators of their activities. And we've really tried to put in a cultural shift. We've been trying for years, but COVID really helped us to say our job is to support the businesses and help them succeed. So we are their servants, we are their concierge to get them to what they need in order to succeed. And that's been really, I think, very helpful. And I hope that that sticks around. But the other thing I'll mention is this just talks yet again about the inflexibility of tools that we have here at the city. So in Calgary, we have seen, because of the way our assessment works, because we've gone from 0% downtown vacancy to 30% in 18 months, it means that the value of those downtown businesses have plummeted, meaning that everyone outside, so they've gotten huge tax breaks, 70, 80% tax breaks. But that means that everyone outside of the downtown core has seen massive tax increases. And that's really challenging because they just can't afford them. And I don't have the ability to target assistance to those businesses. Everyone has to pay the same rate. So as a result, in spending about $500 million in preventing the tax increases for those businesses, I've also prevented tax increases for giant real estate firms like Cadillac Fairview, giant multinational companies like Walmart, instead of just putting the money where it's needed at the local dry cleaner or lunch counter. So that's been really, really challenging for us. However, the assessment business has helped in one way, to answer David's question very directly, which is next year, the average hotel in Calgary will see a 30% decline in their tax rate because we do annual assessment here. But of course, that means the dry cleaners and the lunch counters catch it again.
Well, in the ripple effect, I know, for instance, our tourism authority is funded by and large by a municipal accommodation tax. Well, if no one is staying in hotels because no one is traveling, that has a direct impact on our ability to market Ottawa as a tourism destination. And people are being very cautious. They're not traveling. I think in many ways it may help a little bit the domestic tourism industry, for the simple reason that people don't want to go to Florida and because of the challenges there and out of control COVID situation, plus the fact that you have to self-quarantine for 14 days there and 14 days on your way back. So we may see more marketing done to encourage Canadians to visit their own country, which is a good thing, but still it's really tough to market that when your budget has been cut by, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's probably 50-60% as a result of the municipal accommodation tax not generating the revenues that it would normally be generating without COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll say that the questions that we got in had a really big focus on this aspect, particularly in the context of continued remote work and what that's going to mean, continued health restrictions and what that looks like. And I can definitely attest to the fact that out of the gates, the mayors across the country have really been advocating for their main streets, their local businesses, almost ahead of the city interests at the beginning, to make sure that this is something that is focused on by the federal government and provincial government as well.
Carole, I think one thing is important to be said, though, because we've been sort of focusing a little bit on problems and gloom and doom and deficits and it's all true. None of it has been true. We have in Calgary, Ottawa, Toronto, and in our country as a whole, and I think more so today than ever before, including even earlier this week, we have an opportunity. Still, all the good bones, as I describe them, are there of our cities: quality of life, excellent educational institutions, great critical mass of different industries, whether it's financial services, tech, energy, life sciences. And so, I think that while we can talk about how tough it's going to be to come back and how tough it's going to be for small business, the fact is we have better bones than probably many other places in the world. So that, if we can just get it right in terms of causing those businesses to be able to hang on through some of these programs, getting out of their way, which is an important part of, I think, what Ned was talking about, and becoming their partners, making sure that the governments continue to work together. I think we can have a recovery that, it'll take some time, but it's going to be robust because this country has so much going for it. And it's big cities in particular. Its big cities are among the most admired in the world. And there was a reason for that. No reason for complacency. So I just think it's really important that we focus on that and say, okay, let's not miss this opportunity. Again, Canada has yet another moment in time for its cities to benefit from that. We got to reopen immigration again and get that going as soon as possible. I was very heartened to hear what the minister said the other day about that, because that's going to help bring the smart people in here that we need. So I just want to put a note of hope in there, because I just think our country is, again, well positioned as it was before, notwithstanding all the sort of damage and carnage from pandemic, to really be, a leader again, if we play our cards right and do all the things we've talked about and collaborate with each other and get the private sector to do what it does best.
Thanks, Mayor Tory. Ending on a note of hope is a good one, I think, to end on. And mayors, you hear this from me often. We're at time. You've got to move forward. So I'll just thank the three of you very much for your engagement and conversation today, and to everybody who tuned in. I think my job here is really just to now hand it over to Rob LeForte from Municipal Advocacy Solutions for some closing comments.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. You too. Thanks, Carole.
Thank you, Carole, and I'm proud to thank you all on behalf of Municipal Advocacy Solutions, not just for your time and your thoughtful responses today, but also for your leadership in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the months ahead, we know that municipalities will continue to weather the storm, and that it's really municipalities' success that is going to help Canada recover quickly when making sure that housing is available, and that projects are underway to support economic growth. We greatly appreciate Carole's time as well as moderator and her leadership in representing municipalities collectively, and congratulate her on her relatively new role. And I'm now going to turn things over to Zina Sorani from the Canadian Club Board. And Zina's got a little bit of a door prize to play with us.
Thanks, Rob. So before we get to that, on behalf of the board and also my co-lead of today's event, Danielle McGee, I'd like to thank Carole Saab very much for moderating our esteemed panel of mayors Tory, Nenshi, and Watson today. And thank you very much to the mayors for your time and for sharing your insights with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you all to our guests who joined us virtually today. And thank you also to our sponsors, Shaw Communications and Municipal Advocacy Solutions, without whom today's event would not have been possible. So without further ado, as Heather mentioned at the beginning of the show, we will now do our draw for a free subscription to iPolitics. So I'm going to ask the mayors to each pick a number between 1 and 300. So we'll start here in Ottawa and we'll go east to west. So Mayor Watson?
3.
3, okay.
3.
And going to Toronto, Mayor Tory?
125.
125, okay. And now to Calgary, Mayor Nenshi?
247.
Explain
But the price is right.
It's the opposite of Price is Right rules. I want to go over. I figure the late registrants get a right to try and win.
For sure, everyone gets a chance. So the way that it'll work is we'll be sending an email with a free subscription offer to iPolitics to the people who signed up for today's event in that place in the roster. So congratulations to our 3 lucky winners. And at our next event, we will hold a draw for a free subscription to the Hill Times. So on that note, please join us for our next event on November 12th, entitled The Moral Injuries of COVID-19, featuring Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire and the Executive Director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. And on November 24th, we are pleased to present Unlocking Alberta's Potential, Fresh Solutions for Familiar Challenges, featuring Alberta's Minister of Job, Economy and Innovation, Doug Schweitzer. Please visit us at www.canadianclubottawa.ca for more details. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.